On March 11, 2011, Japan experienced one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded.
The earthquake struck beneath the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of kilometers from Japan's eastern coastline.
For several terrifying minutes, the seafloor shifted violently beneath an immense column of water.
That sudden movement displaced an enormous volume of seawater across the Pacific Ocean.
At first, the tsunami was almost invisible in the deep ocean, moving incredibly fast toward Japan.
As the waves approached shallower coastal waters, their enormous hidden energy began transforming. The ocean began rising dramatically as the incoming waves encountered the shallow seabed near shore.
Within minutes, the calm coastline was facing a wall of water unlike anything most residents had seen.
The shaking lasted for several minutes, sending buildings, roads, bridges, and entire communities into violent motion. Across northeastern Japan, engineers immediately realized they were witnessing an extraordinary geological event.
The earthquake also triggered powerful landslides across the mountainous regions surrounding Japan's northeastern coastline.
Railway lines buckled, highways cracked, and transportation networks across the region were suddenly disrupted.
But the earthquake at El was only the beginning of Japan's greatest danger that afternoon. Offshore, the displaced ocean was already racing toward the Japanese coast at extraordinary speed. The first warning signs appeared as the sea suddenly began behaving in an unnatural way. Along the coast, seawalls stood between the approaching ocean and thousands of homes.
These barriers had been designed to protect communities from the powerful waves that regularly threatened Japan.
For decades, Japan had invested heavily in engineering defenses against the unpredictable power of the Pacific. From above, these defenses looked enormous, but the approaching tsunami was even larger. Then the water reached the coastline, and everything changed within moments.
The first wave slammed into the coastal defenses with unimaginable force and speed.
Water began pouring over barriers that had protected Japanese communities for generations. The flood moved inland rapidly, carrying vehicles, boats, debris, and everything standing in its path. Entire harbor districts disappeared beneath the advancing water within a matter of minutes. For people watching from higher ground, the scale of the flooding was almost impossible to comprehend. The tsunami continued pushing inland, far beyond the coastline and deep into the surrounding communities. Roads that had carried thousands of vehicles each day were transformed into powerful channels of moving water. The force of the water was strong enough to move heavy objects that seemed impossible to displace. Concrete buildings resisted the surge, while weaker structures were swept apart by the advancing flood. By the time the water reached its greatest inland extent, the coastline had become almost unrecognizable.
Emergency crews struggled to reach isolated communities as roads and bridges remained flooded or severely damaged.
Helicopters became essential for reaching people stranded above the rapidly spreading floodwaters.
Across the region, thousands of people were forced to evacuate toward higher ground.
Schools, community centers, and elevated buildings suddenly became shelters for displaced residents.
The disaster exposed a critical question. Could Japan's massive coastal defenses actually protect people? Many barriers had worked exactly as engineers intended, slowing the water and buying precious time. But the tsunami exceeded the assumptions behind many of those defenses by a devastating margin.
Water heights reached levels that many coastal communities had never experienced in living memory.
The lesson was clear. Even enormous engineering projects have limits against nature.
Japan now faced a difficult question. How could it rebuild without simply repeating the past?
Engineers began studying every failure, measuring what survived and what had been swept away.
They discovered that some barriers had performed exactly as designed, while others had been overwhelmed by extraordinary conditions.
The goal was no longer simply to build higher walls, but to create multiple layers of protection.
Reconstruction would change the coastline itself, reshaping communities around the reality of future tsunamis.
Across Tohoku, entire neighborhoods were moved to higher ground, farther from the ocean.
New roads were elevated, evacuation routes widened, and critical infrastructure was redesigned.
In some places, forests and open land became part of the defense system.
These barriers were designed not to guarantee safety, but to buy people valuable time. Every extra minute could mean more people reaching higher ground before the water arrived.
But no defense could remove the need for people to understand the warning signs.
Japan also strengthened evacuation towers and buildings where reaching distant hills was impossible. Some communities chose to combine seawalls with elevated shelters, stronger buildings, and clearly planned escape routes. The coastline became a carefully engineered landscape, where natural terrain and human infrastructure worked together. The objective was resilience, reducing the damage, preserving escape time, and protecting as many lives as possible.
The reconstruction also changed how Japan thought about the sea itself. The sea remained powerful, unpredictable, and impossible to completely control.
Instead, engineers focused on understanding its behavior and designing for uncertainty. That meant preparing for events larger than previous experience had considered likely. Modern defenses therefore became part of a much larger strategy built around preparation. The new approach recognized that no single structure could protect every community from every possible tsunami.
Different coastlines required different solutions, depending on geography, population, and the distance to higher ground.
In densely populated areas, vertical evacuation could become just as important as moving inland.
Harbors were redesigned with stronger gates, protected equipment, and routes that could remain usable during emergencies.
The lesson from 2011 was becoming embedded into the physical design of coastal Japan.
Communities also began practicing evacuation more regularly, turning emergency response into a familiar routine.
Schools became important centers for teaching children how quickly coastal danger could develop.
Residents learned that earthquakes themselves could be the first warning that a tsunami was coming. For many coastal residents, recognizing that warning could mean deciding immediately rather than waiting for confirmation. Preparedness could never guarantee survival, but it could give people a better chance. The rebuilding process also forced difficult choices about what should remain, move, or disappear.
Some former residential areas were transformed into open spaces, parks, forests, or flood buffers.
The coastline was becoming less about resisting the ocean and more about living safely beside it. Yet reconstruction remained a constant reminder that the next disaster could arrive without warning. Japan's new defenses were therefore built around a simple principle: prepare for the worst while continuing to live normally.
The same lesson shaped the protection of critical facilities along the coast.
At Fukushima, the tsunami exposed a different kind of vulnerability. Essential systems could fail together.
Backup power and cooling systems were compromised after seawater flooded critical areas.
The disaster showed how quickly a coastal hazard could become a technological emergency.
Fukushima became a lasting reminder that tsunami preparedness had to include more than protecting people and buildings. When the water finally receded, the full scale of the destruction became visible. Entire neighborhoods had been stripped of homes, roads, vehicles, and the infrastructure that connected them. Ports that had supported local economies were left filled with debris, damaged vessels, and unusable equipment. Railways and highways were severed, making rescue and recovery far more difficult. For rescuers, every blocked road and damaged bridge represented another obstacle between help and survivors. Recovery crews began clearing roads, restoring power, and reopening routes into isolated communities. Heavy machinery worked continuously, turning chaotic debris fields back into usable ground.
Temporary shelters became crowded centers where displaced families waited for homes and communities to return.
For many survivors, rebuilding meant deciding whether to return or begin again somewhere else.
The disaster had destroyed places, but it also forced Japan to reconsider what a safer coastal community should look like.
Engineers also questioned the assumptions that had shaped Japan's earlier coastal defenses. Many seawalls had been designed around historical tsunami records and expected wave heights.
The 2011 tsunami exceeded many of those expectations by a devastating margin.
The problem was not simply that the walls were too low. The hazard itself had been underestimated. That realization changed the philosophy of coastal engineering across Japan.
Seawalls would slow the water, while elevated land and evacuation structures would provide additional protection. Gates and barriers could protect key facilities, but they could not replace evacuation.
The new strategy accepted that some water could still get through. What mattered was reducing the force, limiting the reach, and creating time for people to escape. Japan's coastal redesign also introduced large movable gates to protect vulnerable bays and river mouths. These gates could close when necessary, protecting inland areas while allowing rivers and ports to function normally. In other areas, entire sections of land were raised to place homes and public buildings above flood levels. The result was a coastline where safety became part of urban planning rather than an afterthought. But every improvement came with a difficult trade-off between protection, cost, landscape, and community life. For coastal communities, the question was never simply how much concrete could be built. It was also about preserving the places, industries, and communities that depended on the shoreline.
Some residents questioned whether enormous walls could ever provide enough security to justify their impact.
Others argued that after 2011, accepting greater protection was worth changing the coastline. And
there was no perfect answer, only different ways of balancing risk and daily life.
More than a decade after the disaster, many rebuilt communities look dramatically different from 2011.
New seawalls, raised neighborhoods, evacuation towers, and redesigned ports now form a layered coastal landscape. Yet Japan still relies on something no wall can replace: rapid evacuation and public awareness. The technology can reduce risk, but people still have to recognize danger and act.
The memory of March 11 remains part of how these communities understand the ocean.
The country now prepares for tsunamis that could be larger, faster, or different from anything experienced before. Forecasting systems have improved, but warnings still depend on speed, communication, and people responding immediately.
Japan cannot prevent every tsunami, but it can reduce how many lives and communities are lost.
The goal is not to defeat the ocean, but to give people the best possible chance against it. And after everything Japan endured, that preparation may be the most important lesson left behind.